Imagine a civilization so powerful that its kings ruled from shining palaces, its armies marched across continents, and its knowledge was preserved on clay tablets that still speak to us today. This was Assyria, an empire that rose from the banks of the Tigris River to shape the destiny of the ancient world. But how did it begin? How did it rise? And why did it fall? Stay with us as we uncover the forgotten story of Assyria, the conquerors who built civilization. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this journey with others, so together we can keep history alive. When we speak of ancient civilizations, our minds often turn to the towering pyramids of Egypt, the marble temples of Greece, or the vast empire of Rome. Yet, long before those names echoed across history, there was a people who rose from the fertile banks of the Tigris River. These were the Assyrians, a nation whose beginnings were humble, but whose destiny would shape the story of the ancient Near East. The birthplace of the Assyrians lay in Mesopotamia, a land often called the cradle of civilization. The word Mesopotamia means the land between rivers, referring to the Tigris and the Euphrates. Between these two lifelines of water stretched fertile soil that supported crops, trade, and cities. Here, in northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians first emerged. Their earliest heartland was centered around the city of Assur, a settlement that would lend its name both to the people and their god. Assur was more than just a city. It was both a sacred place and a practical hub. Its position along the Tigris River allowed the Assyrians to grow barley, wheat, and dates. They raised sheep and cattle in the grassy plains, while the surrounding hills provided timber and stone. The river itself was a highway, linking them with other towns and distant lands. From the very beginning, geography gave the Assyrians both opportunity and challenge. They lived at the crossroads of civilizations, surrounded by rivals but also by possibilities. The culture of early Assyria was not created in isolation. It was born in conversation with its neighbors. To the south lay Sumer and Akkad, civilizations already rich with traditions of writing, law, and temple building. The Assyrians absorbed these influences, but they did not simply copy them. They adapted and shaped them into their own identity. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform writing show that Assyrian scribes learned from Sumerian teachers, yet developed their own records and languages. The temples they built followed Mesopotamian styles, but they dedicated them with unique devotion to their chief deity, the god Assur. Religion was at the center of their lives. Assur, both the city and the god, represented the heart of their world. To the Assyrians, their land and their destiny were tied to divine favor. They built ziggurats, towering temple structures, as stairways between heaven and earth. Priests performed rituals to honor the gods, seeking blessings for fertile crops and protection from enemies. In these early centuries, the Assyrians were not yet conquerors. They were farmers, traders, and worshippers trying to survive and prosper in a land full of challenges. Yet even in these beginnings, we see signs of what the Assyrians would later become. Their location in northern Mesopotamia placed them close to trade routes that stretched from Anatolia in the west to Persia in the east. Merchants carried tin, copper, and textiles along these paths, and Assyria became a natural link between worlds. Assyrian traders are known to have established colonies as far away as Anatolia, where they exchanged goods and ideas. This habit of reaching outward, of building connections beyond their homeland, would remain part of their character for centuries. Politically, early Assyria was organized as a collection of city-states. Each city had its local rulers, priests, and councils. Over time, however, Assur began to rise above the others. Its leaders claimed not only political power but also spiritual authority, for to rule Assur was to serve the god Assur himself. This merging of politics and religion was crucial. Unlike other kingdoms where kings ruled in their own name, The Assyrian ruler was seen as the earthly representative of the divine. His duty was not only to govern but also to protect the sacred order of the world. As centuries passed, the Assyrians faced both prosperity and hardship. The fertile land gave them resources, but it also attracted rivals. Neighboring powers often sought control of Mesopotamia, and the Assyrians were forced to defend themselves. These early conflicts taught them discipline, organization, and the value of strong leadership. It is here that we can trace the first steps toward the militarized society they would later become famous for, though in these early times their focus was still survival rather than domination. Culturally, the Assyrians grew alongside their neighbors. They adopted cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system first developed by the Sumerians. Through this, they recorded their trade, their prayers, and their laws. Archaeological discoveries show clay tablets filled with contracts, inventories, and even myths. These writings reveal a people who valued order, record-keeping, and tradition. At the same time, their art reflected both practicality and devotion. Carvings showed scenes of farming, worship, and trade. The early Assyrians may not yet have produced the monumental palaces and sculptures that would come later, but their creativity was already visible. Geography also shaped their identity in another way. Unlike the wide plains of southern Mesopotamia, northern Assyria was more rugged, with hills and mountains rising in the distance. This environment demanded resilience. To farm the land, the Assyrians had to master irrigation. To travel, they had to build roads. To survive winters, they had to store grain and prepare carefully. These challenges forged a character that was disciplined and resourceful. It is not difficult to see how such habits would later help them build and manage a vast empire. The earliest rulers of Assyria are known more from tradition than from firm historical records, but they left behind an image of leadership tied closely to religion. They called themselves not only kings but also servants of the god Assur. This sense of divine mission gave their authority a unique strength. It meant that their conquests, their laws, and their achievements were framed not just as human ambition, but as part of a sacred duty. By the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, Assyria was firmly established as a small but distinct power in Mesopotamia. Its people had developed a clear identity, a connection to trade networks, and a tradition of combining faith with governance. They were not yet the great empire that would dominate the ancient Near East, but the foundations were already in place. The river, the city, and the god had shaped them into a people ready for growth. Looking back, it is striking to see how the seeds of empire were planted in such modest soil. From farmers and traders in a single city, the Assyrians would one day command an empire stretching across continents. Their story begins not with conquest, but with adaptation, resilience, and faith. The lessons they learned in these early centuries, discipline, record-keeping, devotion, and ambition, would guide them through both triumph and hardship. In the quiet fields along the Tigris, the Assyrians built the first chapter of their history. They did not yet know it, but the world would one day remember them as masters of administration, guardians of ancient knowledge, and builders of cities that glittered like stars in the desert. Before the grandeur came the beginnings, and it is in these beginnings that we discover the heart of Assyria, a people shaped by their land, their gods, and their dreams. The story of Assyria does not remain in the shadows of its beginnings. From a cluster of farming towns along the Tigris River, it grew into a kingdom of strength and vision. The centuries that followed the foundation of Assur are often seen as Assyria's classical age, a time when its rulers, merchants, and priests laid the patterns that would shape the future. In this period, Assyria moved beyond survival and began to form the structures of a true state. At the heart of this transformation was the city of Assur. Built on a high bluff overlooking the river, it became more than a settlement. It was a symbol of continuity and sacred authority. The people believed that the god Assur lived within the city itself, and to serve the city was to serve the god. This unique relationship between city, deity, and people gave Assyria a cohesion that other Mesopotamian cities often lacked. Kings ruled not simply as men of power, but as guardians of a divine trust. The early rulers of Assyria began to organize their authority more firmly. They established royal dynasties and passed power through hereditary lines, ensuring stability. These kings bore titles that connected them to the god Assur, presenting themselves as stewards rather than absolute monarchs. Yet, in practice, they wielded considerable control. They oversaw building projects, managed trade, and defended their lands against rivals. Over time, their role became central not only in politics but also in the cultural imagination of their people. Economically, this age saw growth and complexity. Assyria's location placed it on important trade routes, linking Mesopotamia with Anatolia and beyond. Merchants carried wool, textiles, and agricultural products northward, while metals such as copper and tin traveled south into Assyria. In time, these exchanges enriched the kingdom. Archaeologists have discovered records of Assyrian trading colonies in distant regions, especially in Anatolia. These colonies were not military outposts but commercial communities, filled with merchants and scribes. They reveal how deeply Assyria had become tied to international commerce, even in its early classical age. Within the city, artisans and craftsmen flourished. Pottery, weaving, and metalwork grew in quality, supported by the resources of trade. Agricultural advances allowed surpluses, feeding larger populations and supporting specialized workers. With food security came the growth of cities and the development of urban culture. Streets, markets, and temples bustled with activity. Daily life revolved around both commerce and devotion. For every transaction, every harvest, and every political decision was believed to rest under the eye of the gods. Culturally, Assyria drew deeply from Mesopotamian traditions. The system of cuneiform writing was used to record not only trade agreements but also royal decrees and literary works. Myths and epics from Sumer and Akkad were copied and preserved, linking Assyria with the broader heritage of the region. Over time, however, Assyrians began to add their own voices to this tradition. They wrote prayers to the god Assur, hymns to Ishtar, and royal inscriptions that celebrated their achievements. These texts show a growing sense of identity, a pride that distinguished them from their neighbors. Art and architecture also advanced during this classical age. Temples were enlarged and decorated with reliefs. Carved seals bore intricate images of gods, animals, and mythological scenes. These works were not merely decorative. They reflected the worldview of a people who saw themselves in constant dialogue with the divine. The city itself grew in splendor, its walls strengthened, its markets expanded, and its temples rising higher above the river. Each new building proclaimed the stability and ambition of Assyria. Politically, the kingdom began to extend its influence. While not yet the vast empire of later centuries, Assyria asserted itself as a regional power. Its kings conducted campaigns to secure trade routes and protect borders. These efforts were as much about economic security as they were about prestige. By demonstrating strength, Assyria could command respect from neighbors and ensure the flow of resources that sustained its people. What made this period especially significant was the balance between tradition and innovation. On the one hand, Assyria honored the legacies of Mesopotamian culture, from the use of cuneiform to the worship of ancient gods. On the other hand, it shaped these traditions into something distinct. The fusion of political power with religious devotion, the emphasis on record-keeping and administration, and the establishment of trade colonies far from the homeland. All these marked Assyria as unique. One of the most telling features of this era was the role of the king as builder. Royal inscriptions from later centuries recall how early rulers of Assur expanded temples, repaired walls, and sponsored irrigation systems. These acts were not only practical but symbolic. To build was to demonstrate power, stability, and piety. Each project reinforced the image of the king as a servant of Assur, entrusted with the prosperity of the land. Religion remained central. The pantheon of Assyria included many Mesopotamian gods, Ishtar, Shamash, and Ninurta among them, but the god Assur occupied the highest place. Over time, this emphasis on Assur became a defining feature of the kingdom. To outsiders, it set Assyria apart. To insiders, it gave their nation a clear spiritual anchor. Festivals, rituals, and offerings filled the calendar, binding the community together in shared devotion. The classical age of Assyria also revealed an enduring theme: resilience. The kingdom faced challenges from rival states, shifting trade routes, and the natural difficulties of life in Mesopotamia. Yet it endured. Its institutions of governance, its traditions of writing, and its religious devotion provided a strong foundation. Even when pressure mounted, Assyria adapted. It is this resilience that explains why the kingdom not only survived but also prepared for expansion in the centuries to come. By the close of this period, Assyria was no longer simply a city among cities. It had developed a stable political system, an economy tied to distant lands, and a cultural identity rooted in both tradition and innovation. Ashur stood as a beacon of continuity, its temples and palaces reminding the people of their connection to the divine. Merchants traveled far, scribes recorded the events of their time, and kings proclaimed their role as guardians of both faith and state. Looking back, we can see that this classical age was the true foundation of the Assyrian story. Without it, the later empire could not have been built. The habits of administration, the devotion to record-keeping, the fusion of religion and politics, and the confidence to reach beyond their borders, all these were forged in this era. Assyria was becoming more than a regional kingdom. It was becoming a model of organized power, a civilization ready to grow. Thus, the classical age stands as a bridge between beginnings and greatness. It shows us a people who, through discipline, faith, and ambition, transformed their modest homeland into a kingdom of influence. In the markets of Assur, in the prayers sung at temples, and in the records etched into clay tablets, we find the seeds of empire. Assyria was learning how to be strong, and the world was beginning to take notice. The land of Assyria was not isolated. It stood at a natural crossroads where rivers, mountains, and trade routes converged. This position gave the Assyrians opportunities for growth, but also placed them in constant contact with other civilizations. During the centuries following the Classical Age, Assyria absorbed many foreign influences that would shape its culture, economy, and politics. These encounters were not simply exchanges of goods, but of ideas, beliefs, and innovations. In this way, Assyria became both a student and a teacher in the great network of ancient civilizations. To the south lay Babylonia, a land with a deep and prestigious heritage. Babylonia inherited the legacies of Sumer and Akkad, and it was famed for its temples, learning, and law codes. The Assyrians admired and adopted much from their Babylonian neighbors. They borrowed myths and stories, preserving them in cuneiform tablets. Tales of gods and heroes that originated in Sumerian and Babylonian traditions found their way into Assyrian libraries, where they were copied and retold. The famous Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, was treasured by Assyrian scribes, who considered it part of their cultural inheritance. Babylonia also influenced Assyria through religion. While the Assyrians placed the god Assur at the center of their faith, they incorporated many deities from the broader Mesopotamian pantheon. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, became especially prominent in Assyrian devotion. Her temples and festivals reflected a cultural blending, showing how Assyria could adapt foreign traditions into its own spiritual life. Through such influences, Assyria gained depth and richness, weaving together local devotion with broader Mesopotamian beliefs. To the west were the Hittites of Anatolia. This Indo-European people built a powerful kingdom with advanced techniques in governance and diplomacy. The Assyrians encountered the Hittites both in trade and in rivalry. From them, the Assyrians learned the value of treaties, alliances, and written agreements. In fact, the use of official documents to seal political relationships owes much to such contact. The Hittites also mastered the use of iron, a material stronger than bronze. Though it would take time for Assyria to fully adopt ironworking, the influence was undeniable. The presence of Hittite merchants and envoys introduced the Assyrians to new materials and methods, laying the groundwork for future advances. Farther still, Assyria's reach touched Egypt. While direct contact was limited in the early centuries, the reputation of Egypt as a land of immense wealth and ancient wisdom was well known. Egyptian art, symbols, and luxury goods traveled through trade networks into Mesopotamia, where they were admired and sometimes imitated. Exotic materials such as ivory and gold came from these connections, and Assyrian artisans learned to incorporate them into their own crafts. Egypt's religious symbols also fascinated the Mesopotamian world, reminding the Assyrians that they were part of a larger cultural sphere stretching across the Near East. Trade was the lifeline of these encounters. Assyrian merchants did not remain within their own borders. They traveled north to Anatolia, east toward Persia, and west toward Syria and beyond. Their caravans carried woolen textiles, prized across the region, while bringing back metals, timber, and luxury items. These exchanges were more than economic. They exposed the Assyrians to new technologies, languages, and customs. A merchant returning from Anatolia might bring with him not only tin for bronze, but also stories, symbols, and fresh ideas. Foreign influences were also visible in art and architecture. Decorative motifs traveled across borders, appearing on seals, jewelry, and temple reliefs. The winged figures and hybrid creatures common in Assyrian art reveal inspiration from neighboring lands. Yet, the Assyrians did not merely copy. They reimagined these symbols in ways that expressed their own worldview, creating a distinctive style that would later become one of the hallmarks of their empire. Perhaps the most profound influence came through writing and scholarship. Assyrian scribes corresponded with their Babylonian counterparts, learning from their centuries of experience. Astronomical observations, medical texts, and mathematical systems were adopted and preserved. In time, Assyria would develop its own centers of learning, but these were built upon the foundations inherited from others. It is a reminder that civilizations do not grow in isolation. They thrive when they absorb and adapt the knowledge of their neighbors. Even politics bore the mark of foreign influence. Assyria's early rulers observed how other kingdoms organized their territories, maintained armies, and legitimized their authority. From these lessons, they began to shape their own approaches. The use of provincial governors, for example, was influenced by the models seen in Babylonia and Anatolia. Over the centuries, Assyria would refine these systems into some of the most efficient administrative structures the ancient world had ever seen. Foreign influence also meant foreign challenge. As Assyria grew, it found itself in rivalry with powerful neighbors. Babylonia often competed for control of trade routes and land. The Hittites pressed into northern Mesopotamia, while tribes from the Zagros Mountains to the east tested Assyria's defenses. These challenges forced the Assyrians to adapt quickly. To remain strong, they had to learn not only to trade with others but also to defend themselves against them. This constant pressure forged resilience and innovation, qualities that would define Assyria in the centuries ahead. What makes this period remarkable is the way Assyria balanced openness with identity. The Assyrians were willing to borrow from others, gods, technologies, and artistic styles, but they never lost sight of who they were. Everything they absorbed was reshaped in the service of their own culture, centered around the god Assur and the city that bore his name. This ability to blend foreign influences while preserving a strong sense of self became one of Assyria's greatest strengths. It allowed them to stand at the crossroads of civilizations without being overwhelmed by them. By the end of this era, Assyria had become a true participant in the international world of the ancient Near East. Its merchants were known in distant markets, its scribes were part of scholarly networks, and its rulers were recognized as serious powers in the region. The seeds planted through these exchanges would soon bear fruit, as Assyria moved from a regional kingdom into a force that would dominate the stage of history. The story of Assyria's foreign influences teaches us that civilizations are never isolated. They are living systems, shaped by both internal growth and external connection. For Assyria, these influences were not threats, but opportunities. Each new idea, each encounter with another people, became a stepping stone on the path to greatness. Thus, when we think of Assyria's rise, we must remember the countless hands and voices from other lands that left their mark. The myths of Babylonia, the iron of the Hittites, the treasures of Egypt, and the knowledge of distant scholars all became part of the Assyrian story. Out of these connections emerged a civilization ready for its next chapter, an age of growth and expansion, when Assyria would transform from a kingdom of traders and farmers into an empire of builders and innovators. Assyria, once a small kingdom clustered around the sacred city of Assur, entered a new stage in its history. This stage can be called the Age of Growth, for it was during these centuries that Assyria began to expand steadily in strength, in territory, and in influence. The kingdom had already learned from its neighbors, borrowed their knowledge, and absorbed their culture. Now it was time to take those lessons and apply them on a broader scale. The growth of Assyria was not sudden. It did not come with a single conquest or a single great ruler. Instead, it unfolded gradually, step by step, like a tree, growing year after year, its roots deepening and its branches spreading outward. The process was marked by economic progress, social change, and the emergence of new political systems that would eventually allow Assyria to become a formidable empire. At the heart of this growth was agriculture. The Assyrians learned to manage the waters of the Tigris more effectively, building canals and irrigation systems that brought life to their fields. With careful planning, they transformed the land into fertile farmland that produced abundant grain, fruits, and vegetables. These surpluses supported a growing population and freed many people from the constant struggle for food. With their basic needs secured, more citizens could engage in crafts, trade, and military service, activities that would push Assyria forward. Craftsmanship and industry also flourished. Assyrian artisans gained fame for their skill in textiles, particularly in producing fine wool garments. These textiles became valuable exports, traded across the Near East. Metalworking advanced as well, with bronze tools and weapons giving way, over time, to iron. This shift, still in its early stages, gave Assyria an advantage in durability and strength. Pottery, jewelry, and decorative arts also reached new levels of sophistication, reflecting both local creativity and foreign inspiration. Trade expanded in all directions. Merchants carried Assyrian goods to Anatolia in the north, to the Levant in the west, and to Elam and beyond in the east. They returned with wood, stone, metals, and luxury goods that could not be found in the Assyrian heartland. This web of commerce connected Assyria to the wider world and filled its cities with a sense of vitality and prosperity. The city of Assur itself grew busier, its markets echoing with the voices of traders from distant lands. With economic prosperity came political development. Assyrian kings strengthened their authority, gradually moving from the role of local leaders to that of rulers with broader ambitions. They established systems of administration to govern newly acquired territories, placing trusted officials as governors in various regions. These governors collected tribute, enforced laws, and ensured loyalty to the central throne. The concept of provincial rule, which would later become a cornerstone of Assyrian imperial power, began to take shape in this era of growth. Military strength supported this political expansion. Assyria had always needed to defend itself against mountain tribes and rival kingdoms. But during this period, its armies became more organized and disciplined. The Assyrians began to experiment with new tactics, combining infantry, archers, and charioteers into more coordinated units. Chariots, pulled by strong horses, gave them mobility and speed on the battlefield. With each successful campaign, Assyria secured more territory, more tribute, and more respect from its neighbors. Religion also played a role in this age of growth. The god Assur was seen not only as the protector of the city, but also as the divine authority behind the kingdom Sur's expansion. Each military victory was interpreted as proof of Assur's favor, while each new territory was considered a gift to the god. Temples were built and expanded, becoming centers of both spiritual life and economic activity. Priests, scribes, and administrators worked together to ensure that the growing state was held together by a shared sense of purpose and divine mission. This period also saw a flourishing of knowledge. Scribes copied and preserved texts on astronomy, medicine, and literature. They recorded omens from the stars, believing that the heavens revealed the will of the gods. They studied plants and animals, seeking cures for diseases and protection from harm. In their libraries, wisdom from earlier civilizations was carefully kept, creating a bridge between the ancient past and the future. The act of preserving knowledge was itself a form of growth, for it ensured that future generations could build upon the work of their ancestors. As Assyria grew, it also faced challenges. Expansion meant confrontation with rival states. Babylonia, still a land of great cultural prestige, often clashed with Assyria over control of trade routes and borderlands. To the west, the Arameans, a Semitic people, moved into Mesopotamia and disrupted established patterns of settlement and trade. These pressures tested Assyria's strength, forcing it to adapt militarily and politically. Yet, rather than halting growth, such challenges often spurred the Assyrians to develop new strategies and reinforce their determination. Urban life blossomed during this time. Cities became centers of administration, religion, and commerce. Their walls protected bustling populations, while their streets were lined with workshops, markets, and homes. The palaces of the kings grew larger and more elaborate, reflecting both wealth and ambition. Reliefs carved into stone began to depict scenes of hunting, warfare, and religious ceremonies, offering a glimpse into the values of Assyrian society. These images celebrated strength, order, and divine favor, qualities that defined the identity of the kingdom. What made this age of growth remarkable was the balance it struck. Assyria was not yet the empire it would one day become. It was still vulnerable, still learning, and still striving. Yet it was no longer a small, fragile city-state. It had become a kingdom with roots deep in the soil of Mesopotamia and branches reaching outward toward the world. Each harvest, each new canal, each caravan of merchants, and each successful campaign added strength to the Assyrian state. The growth of Assyria in this era can be compared to the rising sun. At first, it is a faint light on the horizon, but with time it brightens, spreads, and transforms the world it touches. The Assyrians were building the foundation for greatness, though they may not have fully realized it themselves. What they did know was that their land was prospering, their God was favoring them, and their rulers were guiding them toward a larger destiny. By the end of this period, Assyria was no longer just one of many small kingdoms in Mesopotamia. It was a rising power, ready to challenge its neighbors and expand beyond its traditional borders. The lessons of agriculture, trade, administration, religion, and warfare had combined to give Assyria strength unlike ever before. The next chapters of its history would see this growth explode into empire, as the Assyrians carried their banners far beyond the Tigris Valley. This age of growth reminds us that civilizations are built not only by conquest, but by careful preparation, by the patient work of farmers, merchants, scribes, and artisans. It was their hands and minds that laid the foundation upon which kings could build palaces and generals could win battles. Without this steady and sometimes quiet growth, the empire of Assyria could never have been born. Every civilization that rises must also face times of difficulty. For Assyria, The centuries of growth eventually gave way to an age of crisis. This period did not erase the achievements of earlier generations, but it tested the resilience of the kingdom in ways that shaped its future. The crises came not from a single direction, but from many: political, economic, and social. They were storms that Assyria had to endure before it could rise again. The first sign of crisis was political instability. Strong kings had built Assyria into a respected power, but when the throne passed to weaker rulers, the foundation of authority began to shake. Rival claimants sometimes struggled for control, while ambitious officials sought greater independence. Without firm leadership at the top, the provinces became restless, and loyalty to the central throne was harder to secure. In a land where stability depended on the strength of the king, this was a dangerous weakness. Economic difficulties added to the strain. The prosperity of earlier centuries could not always be sustained. Irrigation canals, so vital to farming, sometimes fell into disrepair, reducing the fertility of the land. Climatic changes brought years of poor harvests, leaving the people vulnerable to hunger. Trade routes, once bustling with merchants, were disrupted by raids and wars. Without steady flows of goods and tribute, the wealth that supported palaces, temples, and armies began to shrink. Foreign pressures also weighed heavily on Assyria. To the south, Babylonia remained a powerful rival, and conflicts between the two states drained resources and morale. To the west, Aramean tribes moved into Mesopotamia in increasing numbers, settling in lands that had once been under Assyrian control. These groups were difficult to defeat, for they moved swiftly and did not depend on fortified cities. To the north and east, mountain tribes harassed the borders, forcing the Assyrians into a constant state of defense. Surrounded by threats, the kingdom felt its strength stretched thin. Inside the cities, ordinary people bore the burden of these crises. Farmers struggled to feed their families when crops failed. Merchants worried as caravans became unsafe. Citizens faced higher taxes as rulers tried to finance armies and restore canals. Temples still stood as symbols of divine favor, but even the gods seemed distant in times of hardship. When victories were scarce and resources were few, the people's faith in both rulers and deities was tested. The image of Assyria during this time is not one of collapse, but of endurance. The kingdom did not vanish, it staggered. Cities like Assur and Nineveh still functioned, though with less splendor. Kings still ruled, though with less authority. Armies still marched, though with fewer victories. What kept Assyria alive was a deep resilience born of centuries of survival in a difficult land. The same determination that had once pushed the people to master the Tigris now gave them the strength to withstand years of adversity. One important aspect of this resilience was memory. The Assyrians remembered their past greatness, their early kings, their thriving trade, and their victories over rivals. These memories became a source of identity and pride. They reminded the people that hardship was temporary and that, with effort, glory could return. Scribes continued to record the events of the time, ensuring that the story of Assyria, even in its struggles, would not be forgotten. Another factor was adaptation. The Assyrians did not remain passive in the face of crisis. They sought new ways to defend themselves against the Arameans, developing lighter troops who could respond quickly to raids. They began to rebuild and reorganize their irrigation networks, learning from mistakes and improving techniques. They cultivated alliances when possible, using diplomacy as well as force. Step by step, they prepared the ground for recovery. Religion also helped sustain the people. The god Assur, though silent in times of defeat, was still regarded as the eternal protector of the nation. Temples continued to receive offerings, prayers continued to be spoken, and rituals continued to be performed. Even when kings were weak, the priests reminded the population that the divine order endured. Faith gave them hope that the god's favor would one day return in full. It is important to see this crisis not as the end of Assyria, but as a pause in its rise. Many civilizations, when faced with such challenges, disappeared from history. But Assyria endured. The difficulties of this era forced the kingdom to rethink its structures, to rebuild its strength, and to search for leaders capable of guiding it out of darkness. In time, such leaders would emerge, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the most powerful stage of Assyria's history, would be born. What lessons can we draw from this age of crisis? One is that prosperity is never permanent. Even the most flourishing states can fall into hardship when leadership falters, when nature turns against them, or when foreign enemies grow stronger. Another is that resilience is as important as strength. The Assyrians could have disappeared, as so many other small kingdoms of Mesopotamia did. But instead they held on, adapting and enduring until better times arrived. The crisis also shows the importance of ordinary people in history. While kings are remembered in inscriptions, it was farmers who repaired the canals, merchants who reopened trade routes, and soldiers who guarded the borders. Without their labor and perseverance, Assyria could not have survived to see its next great chapter. By the end of this troubled era, Assyria was weaker than it had been, but it was still alive. Its cities remained inhabited, its traditions remained strong, and its identity as a people was intact. In the quiet resilience of these years lay the seeds of future greatness. The kingdom was preparing, though slowly and painfully, for a new age. The story of Assyria's time of crisis reminds us that decline is not always destruction. Sometimes it is a season of difficulty that prepares the ground for renewal. Out of the hardships of these centuries, a stronger and more determined Assyria would rise, an empire that would leave its mark on world history. After enduring years of difficulty, Assyria entered a remarkable phase of renewal. This period is known as the Neo-Assyrian Age, when the kingdom transformed itself into one of the most organized and powerful states the ancient world had ever seen. It was a time of modernization, not in the sense of machines or electricity, but in the sense of creating advanced systems of government, administration, communication, and culture that gave Assyria lasting strength. The transformation began with leadership. Strong kings once again sat on the Assyrian throne, determined to restore their land's prestige. These rulers did not simply continue old traditions, they reformed them. They reorganized the administration, expanded the military, and redefined the role of the monarchy. The king was not only a political leader, but also the chief servant of the god Assur, whose divine mission was to bring order to the world. This belief gave the rulers both authority and responsibility, for their success was seen as proof of divine favor. One of the most important reforms was the provincial system. Instead of ruling distant lands loosely, the Neo-Assyrian kings divided their empire into provinces, each governed by an official appointed by the throne. These governors collected taxes, maintained order, and supplied troops when needed. By sending regular reports to the king, they kept him informed of events across the realm. This system of provincial rule created unity and efficiency, allowing the empire to manage vast territories with surprising effectiveness. Communication was another key innovation. The Assyrians built and maintained a network of roads that linked the major cities of the empire. Along these roads, messengers on horseback carried royal orders and information. Relay stations were established so that messages could travel quickly, moving from one rider to the next. What once might have taken weeks could now be delivered in days. This speed of communication gave the Assyrian king the ability to respond to crises swiftly and to coordinate armies spread across great distances. Taxation and tribute also became more organized. Every province contributed resources to the central state, whether in grain, livestock, metals, or labor. Tribute from conquered lands flowed into the empire, filling its treasuries with wealth. These resources were used to build grand palaces, to fund military campaigns, and to support large building projects. The system was not always popular among subject peoples, but it ensured that the empire had the means to sustain its power. The military itself underwent modernization. The Assyrian army became one of the most disciplined and effective forces in the ancient world. Soldiers were equipped with iron weapons, stronger and more durable than bronze. Specialized units were created: infantry with shields and spears, archers who could strike from a distance, and cavalry that replaced the older reliance on chariots. Siege warfare also became an art, with engineers developing techniques to breach the walls of fortified cities. This professional and versatile army gave Assyria a decisive advantage over its rivals. But modernization was not only about administration and warfare. It was also about culture, learning, and the preservation of knowledge. Perhaps the greatest symbol of this was the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era, was not only a warrior but also a scholar. He gathered thousands of clay tablets from across Mesopotamia, preserving texts on history, law, medicine, astronomy, religion, and literature. Among these was the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, which might have been lost to time had it not been preserved in this library. The library was more than a collection; it was a statement. It declared that Assyria valued knowledge as well as power, and that the wisdom of the past should be guarded for future generations. This act of preservation ensured that when Assyria itself faded, its cultural contributions would endure. Indeed, much of what we know today about Mesopotamian literature and science comes from the tablets preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. Architecture also reflected the modernization of the empire. Kings built grand palaces at Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad, decorated with carved stone reliefs that displayed scenes of hunting, religious ceremonies, and royal triumphs. These palaces were not only residences but also symbols of authority, designed to impress subjects and visitors alike. Their scale and artistry demonstrated the wealth and organization of the state. Religion remained at the heart of Assyrian identity. The god Assur continued to be regarded as the divine guide of the empire, but other deities of Mesopotamia were also honored. Temples were rebuilt and expanded, and rituals were performed with elaborate precision. The connection between the gods, the king, and the people gave a spiritual meaning to the empire's expansion. Conquests were not presented as mere political acts, but as the fulfillment of divine will. One fascinating aspect of Assyria's modernization was its ability to integrate different cultures. As the empire expanded, it encompassed peoples of many languages, traditions, and religions. Instead of erasing these identities, the Assyrians often incorporated them, allowing local customs to continue while demanding loyalty to the central state. This ability to manage diversity was one reason why the empire lasted as long as it did. The daily lives of Assyrians also reflected the stability created by modernization. Farmers tilled the land with improved tools, merchants traveled on safer roads, and artisans found markets for their goods in distant cities. While life was never free from hardship, the structure provided by the empire gave many people opportunities that were scarce in earlier times. For those within the heartland, the Neo-Assyrian state brought a sense of order and prosperity. Of course, modernization had its costs. Tribute was heavy, wars were frequent, and the burden on subject peoples could be severe. Resentment simmered in many corners of the empire. Yet, from the perspective of history, what stands out is the extraordinary level of organization and foresight that allowed Assyria to govern a vast and diverse empire. By the height of the Neo-Assyrian period, Assyria had become more than a kingdom. It was the first true empire of the ancient Near East, stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Egypt, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Its systems of administration, communication, and military organization influenced later empires, from Persia to Rome. In many ways, Assyria laid the blueprint for imperial rule. This era of modernization shows us that power is not only about strength, but also about structure. Assyria did not succeed merely because it won battles, but because it created systems that allowed victories to be sustained. Roads, provinces, taxes, armies, libraries, and palaces. All were parts of a larger vision. Together, they turned Assyria into a model of order in a chaotic world. When we look back at the Neo-Assyrian age, we see more than kings and conquests. We see a civilization that understood the importance of organization, of knowledge, and of legacy. It was a society that combined the might of the sword with the wisdom of the tablet, the grandeur of palaces with the quiet labor of farmers. In its modernization, Assyria achieved not only power but also permanence, leaving behind lessons that echo across the centuries. When we study the story of Assyria, it is easy to focus only on its kings, its wars, and its eventual fall. Yet, to understand its true place in history, we must look at what came after. The legacy of Assyria did not vanish when its empire crumbled. Instead, its systems, its knowledge, and its vision of order flowed into the future, shaping the development of civilizations across the world. One of Assyria's greatest contributions was the idea of the empire itself. Before the Neo-Assyrian age, many kingdoms rose and fell in Mesopotamia, but most ruled only limited territories. Assyria expanded beyond those boundaries, creating a realm that stretched across continents. To govern such a vast land, the Assyrians developed administrative systems that were later copied by other great powers. The Persian Empire, centuries later, would adopt the concept of provinces governed by royal officials, a direct continuation of the Assyrian model. Even the Roman Empire, though distant in time and space, reflected principles first pioneered in Assyria. Efficient roads, centralized authority, and the integration of diverse peoples into a single political order. Communication networks were another enduring legacy. The Assyrian system of roads and relay stations inspired later states to build similar systems. The Persians built their famous Royal Road following the same principles, ensuring swift communication across their vast territories. In this way, Assyria's innovations became the foundation for the interconnectedness that defined many later civilizations. The Assyrian army also left a mark on history. It was among the first to become a truly professional and permanent force, rather than a temporary militia raised only during times of war. Its organization into specialized units, infantry, cavalry, archers, and engineers, set a pattern for future armies. The emphasis on discipline, training, and coordination became a standard for military structures across the ancient world. While the weapons and tactics of later ages changed, the principle that a standing army could secure and maintain an empire was an Assyrian legacy. Assyria's cultural contributions were just as important. The Library of Ashurbanipal preserved not only Assyrian works but also texts from earlier civilizations, including Sumerian and Babylonian writings. Without this effort, much of Mesopotamia's literary and scientific heritage might have been lost forever. It is thanks to the Assyrians that we can still read the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories. The preservation of medical, astronomical, and religious texts also ensured that knowledge flowed into later cultures, influencing Greek, Persian, and even medieval scholarship. Religion and mythology, too, spread beyond Assyria. The Assyrians shared with Babylonia the great myths of Mesopotamia, the tales of creation, the stories of divine struggles, and the rituals that honored the gods. These beliefs influenced later cultures, and echoes of Mesopotamian myth can even be found in biblical traditions. Assyria was not isolated from its neighbors. It was part of a wider cultural network that shaped the spiritual imagination of the ancient Near East. In architecture and art, the Assyrians left their mark through their monumental palaces and detailed stone reliefs. These reliefs, carved into walls, depicted scenes of royal life, hunts, and ceremonies. They combined realism with symbolism, celebrating both human achievement and divine order. Later, empires admired and imitated this blending of artistry and propaganda. The grandeur of Assyrian palaces set a precedent for rulers who sought to display their power through architecture, from the Persian kings at Persepolis to the emperors of Rome. The concept of centralized power also influenced political thought. Assyrian kings presented themselves not only as warriors but also as caretakers of the land and servants of the gods. Their authority was absolute, but it was also tied to responsibility. This model of kingship, combining political might with divine duty, echoed through later monarchies in the ancient Near East and beyond. Even though later rulers adapted the idea to their own cultures, the Assyrian example remained a reference point for what a great king should be. Yet, Assyria's influence was not only in what it created, but also in what it taught through its downfall. When the empire collapsed in the late 7th century before the Common Era, it showed the world that even the strongest powers are not eternal. Other states, like Babylonia and later Persia, studied Assyria's rise and fall, learning both from its successes and from its mistakes. This lesson, that strength must be balanced with stability, and that empires are fragile if they rule through fear alone, remains relevant even today. The rediscovery of Assyria in modern times also adds to its world-shaping legacy. For centuries after its fall, the ruins of Assyrian cities lay buried under earth and sand. Local people told stories of ancient kings, but much was forgotten. In the 19th century, European explorers and archaeologists uncovered the remains of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad. They found palaces, reliefs, and thousands of clay tablets. These discoveries astonished the world, revealing a civilization whose memory had almost vanished. The study of Assyria helped create the modern science of archaeology and gave humanity a deeper understanding of its ancient roots. Today, Assyria continues to influence identity and culture. For modern Assyrian communities, scattered across the globe, the memory of their ancient heritage is a source of pride and continuity. They see in the ruins of Nineveh and in the words of ancient inscriptions a reflection of their enduring spirit. In this way, Assyria shapes not only history books but also living traditions. When we consider Assyria's place in world history, it becomes clear that its impact was far greater than the span of its empire. It provided models of governance, administration, and military organization that became standards for future states. It preserved the wisdom of earlier civilizations and passed it on to later ones. It created art and architecture that inspired generations. And through its rediscovery, it reminded the modern world of the deep connections between past and present. The story of Assyria is, therefore, not just a story of conquest and decline. It is a story of influence, of ideas that traveled across time and space. It shows how a civilization can continue to shape the world long after its cities have fallen silent. In many ways, Assyria built the framework of empire, a framework that echoes through history to this day. The story of Assyria, like the story of many ancient civilizations, is both distant and near. It is distant because its empire fell more than 2.5 millennia ago. Its kings and soldiers long vanished, its palaces reduced to ruins. Yet it is near because its influence still flows through the systems we live in, the stories we tell, and the questions we ask about power, identity, and memory. To speak of Assyria is to speak of humanity's journey itself. When we reflect on Assyria's legacy, the first lesson that emerges is the endurance of knowledge. In the city of Nineveh, King Ashurbanipal's great library preserved texts from across Mesopotamia. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform carried myths, scientific observations, prayers, and chronicles. When archaeologists uncovered these tablets in the 19th century, they opened a window into the oldest layers of human thought. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered among them, still speaks to readers today with its meditation on friendship, loss, and the search for immortality. Through this library, Assyria reached across time, ensuring that voices from the deep past would never fall silent. Another legacy lies in the structures of power that Assyria pioneered. The centralized government, the appointment of governors, the use of a professional standing army, and the construction of an empire that linked diverse lands under one authority. All these became models for later states. The Persians refined them, the Greeks encountered them, and the Romans adapted them. Even in our modern world, echoes of Assyria can be seen in the bureaucracies and military systems that govern nations. It is a reminder that ideas outlive empires. Yet Assyria also offers a warning. Its empire was mighty, but its foundations were brittle. The reliance on conquest, the use of fear as a tool of control, and the constant demands placed upon conquered peoples created deep resentments. When its enemies united, Assyria collapsed with surprising speed. In less than 2 decades, the once mighty empire disappeared. This teaches us that power based only on force cannot endure. Stability requires more than strength. It requires trust, cooperation, and a vision that unites rather than divides. Assyria's art and culture also left a profound impact. The stone reliefs from palaces such as those of Nineveh and Nimrud depict scenes of war and hunting, but also show the elegance of royal life, the rituals of the court, and the presence of the gods. These works are more than decoration. They are records of how the Assyrians saw themselves and their world. They blend realism with symbolism, offering insights into ancient psychology, the attention to detail, the portrayal of human and animal figures, and the combination of narrative with imagery influenced later traditions of art. Even today, these reliefs inspire awe when displayed in museums, connecting modern viewers with the hands that carved them so many centuries ago. The memory of Assyria also shaped religious thought. Its myths, shared with Babylonia and other Mesopotamian cultures, carried themes that traveled into later traditions. Stories of creation, floods, divine justice, and cosmic order moved across cultures and languages, leaving traces in biblical narratives and beyond. In this way, Assyria contributed not only to the politics and warfare of its time, but also to the deeper spiritual conversations of humanity. The rediscovery of Assyria in the modern age became a story of its own. For centuries, its name survived mainly in biblical references, often as a symbol of pride and destruction. But in the 19th century, explorers and archaeologists brought its ruins back into light. Palaces were uncovered, inscriptions were translated, and the image of Assyria shifted from myth to history. This rediscovery helped shape modern archaeology, proving that buried civilizations could be recovered through science and patience. Assyria thus gave humanity not only its own history, but also the tools to explore the histories of others. For modern Assyrian communities, scattered across the Middle East and the world, the ancient empire is more than history. It is heritage. The ruins of Nineveh are not only archaeological sites, they are symbols of identity. The cuneiform inscriptions are not only texts, they are voices of ancestors. Despite centuries of upheaval, Assyrian people continued to preserve their language, traditions, and memory. In this continuity, we see that Assyria's legacy is not frozen in the past but lives on in the present. There is also a broader lesson that Assyria gives to the future. It shows us that civilizations are fragile, but their ideas endure. Empires may rise and fall, but knowledge, culture, and identity can survive, adapt, and inspire. The fall of Nineveh was not the end of Assyria's story. It was the beginning of its transformation into a heritage that belongs to all humanity. Each time we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, each time we walk through a museum gallery filled with Assyrian reliefs, each time scholars study a cuneiform tablet, we continue the dialogue that Assyria began. Looking forward, the preservation of Assyria's heritage becomes a shared responsibility. Wars and conflicts in the Middle East have endangered many archaeological sites, and some treasures have been lost to looting and destruction. Yet, international efforts to protect and restore them show that the world recognizes their value. By protecting Assyria's past, we safeguard not only the memory of one civilization, but also the roots of human history. Assyria's story invites us to reflect on our own time. We live in an age of global empires of a different kind, networks of technology, trade, and politics that span the earth. Like Assyria, we face questions about power, justice, and identity. Will our systems endure, or will they collapse under the weight of division and conflict? Assyria, rise and fall remind us that the answers lie not only in strength, but in wisdom. In the end, the legacy of Assyria is both inspiring and humbling. It inspires us with its achievements, the grandeur of its cities, the brilliance of its scholars, the power of its armies, the endurance of its myths. But it humbles us with its fragility, the speed of its collapse, the silence of its ruins, the reminder that no empire is eternal. Between inspiration and humility lies the true gift of history, perspective. To study Assyria is to look into a mirror of humanity. We see our ambition, our creativity, our desire for greatness. We also see our vulnerability, our tendency toward excess, and the limits of power. Assyria's voice, carried across millennia, whispers to us, build wisely, preserve knowledge, and remember that what we create today will become the legacy of tomorrow. Thus, the story of Assyria does not end. It continues in libraries, in museums, in the traditions of its descendants, and in the lessons we carry forward. It is a reminder that history is not only about the past, it is about the choices we make for the future. The story of Assyria is far from over. Each chapter reveals not only the greatness of an empire, but also the lessons it left behind for us today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, like, and share so you don't miss the next part of this journey into the forgotten world of Assyria. History lives on when we explore it together.